Please subscribe. Once upon a time, in the early 16th century, Chinese merchants began making trading voyages to Manila, even before the arrival of the Spanish. They settled across the Pasig River in an area granted to them by the Muslim king, and were initially friendly towards the Spanish, who had rescued a disabled Chinese ship off Mindoro in 1571. However, the relationship between the Chinese and Spanish soon turned violent, with armed conflicts erupting. The Spanish had become concerned with the amount of profit the Chinese were making from trade, and were also worried about being far outnumbered by the Chinese, who totaled 10,000 in Manila in comparison to 2,000 Spaniards. In 1586, the Spanish forced the Chinese out of the city to a swampy area northeast of the city walls. Despite the setback, the Chinese soon developed this as a thriving town with a pond in its center. By 1590, in addition to trade, the Chinese dominated industries such as bread making, bookbinding, tavern keeping, and stonemasonry. The Dominicans built a church to proselytize to the Chinese in 1587, and by 1603, the Spanish colonial authorities made it an established practice to appoint a Christian Chinese as mayor over all the Chinese. At the same time, the Spanish sought to restrict Chinese enterprises. Around 1600, the Spanish started selling a limited number of residence permits, only 4,000, to the Chinese at 2 reals each. The Spanish also tried to restrict Chinese trade, with a decree approved in 1589 to make all prices of Chinese imports uniform and agreed upon prior to the trading season. In 1593, the Spanish closed Peru to Chinese imports and prohibited Spanish voyages to China. Only certain Spaniards were allowed to trade Chinese goods. In 1593, Governor Gómez Pérez das Mariñas was killed in a mutiny by his Chinese rowers. The rowers fled to Vietnam, where most of them stayed. Some returned to China, where their leader was punished. Fearing an attack by the local Chinese in Manila, the Spanish forced them to relocate to the north side of the Pasig. In 1596, 12,000 Chinese were ejected from Manila and sent back to China. It was in this environment that two Fujian adventurers, Yan Yinglong and Zhang Yi, told Gao Kai, a eunuch tax and a mines commissioner in Fujian, that there was a mountain of gold on the Cavite Peninsula in Manila Bay. A plan was made to send a naval expedition to obtain said gold by attacking Manila, but several censors protested this. Provincial authorities did not believe there was gold where Zhang Yi described but felt they had to send some kind of expedition, if only to prove Zhang false. So an assistant county magistrate, Wang Shai, and a company commander, Yu Yicheng, were sent to confirm the veracity of Zhang's story. Zhang was brought with them in chains. The Ming delegation arrived in March 1603 and was received by the governor, Pedro Bravo de Acuna. They were treated well, but when they tried to administer justice in the Chinese community, they were ordered to stop. In May they made it clear to the governor that they did not believe there was gold in the Philippines, and that Zhang had lied. The governor, suspicious of their motives, ordered them detained. When the Chinese community heard of the detention, they planned a strike in protest. The strike was meant to be a show of force and bargaining tool for the release of the Ming delegation. However, it quickly turned into a full-scale rebellion. The Chinese were well organized and well equipped, with swords, spears, and firearms. They were able to seize control of Sangley and establish a provisional government. The Sangley rebellion became a bloody conflict, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Chinese community was determined to fight for their freedom, and they were able to hold out against the Spanish forces for several months. The Spanish authorities in Manila were alarmed by the rebellion and immediately dispatched troops to quell the uprising. The Spanish soldiers were initially taken aback by the fierce resistance put up by the Chinese rebels. They were not used to fighting against such a determined and well-organized force. The Spanish forces suffered heavy losses in their initial attempts to retake Sangley. Despite their initial setbacks, the Spanish forces were eventually able to gain the upper hand. They were able to cut off the rebels' supply lines and limit their access to food and water. The Chinese rebels began to suffer from disease and malnutrition, and their morale began to falter. In a final effort to end the conflict, the Spanish authorities offered the rebels a peace agreement. The Chinese were promised amnesty and the release of the Ming delegation if they surrendered. The rebels initially refused the offer, but they were eventually forced to accept the terms when they realized they had no other options. The Sangley Rebellion came to an end in 1603, with the Chinese rebels surrendering to the Spanish forces. The Spanish authorities kept their promise and released the Ming delegation, but they did not grant amnesty to the rebels. Instead, they executed the rebel leaders and imposed heavy taxes and restrictions on the Chinese community in Manila. The Sangley Rebellion was a significant event in the history of the Philippines. It demonstrated the determination and fighting spirit of the Chinese community in the face of oppression and discrimination. It also highlighted the brutal tactics employed by the Spanish authorities to maintain their control over the country. In the years that followed, the Chinese community in Manila continued to face persecution and discrimination. However, they never forgot the lessons learned during the Sangley Rebellion. They remained resilient and determined to fight for their rights and freedom, and their contributions to the Philippines continue to be recognized to this day. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.